Hi everyone, time for our Tuesday story. And from today, I'm just going to do one story a day as well. I'm going to, depending how long we're on lockdown, I'm going to run out of stories otherwise. So, this is by an author called Shirley Hughes. Very old school, this one. This is a very old book. And Shirley Hughes wrote a book that was very dear to my heart called Dogger. I'm going to read it to you once. One of my favourite books. It was a book that my mum and dad read to me when I was little. And it's such a delightful book. And as I say, written by Shirley Hughes as well. Lovely illustrations. This one's called Alfie Gets In First. And Alfie, there's a couple of books about Alfie, and they're really good. So, Alfie Gets In First. Written by Shirley Hughes. And I don't know what it says here when it was first published. There we go. First published 1981. So I was 5 when this was first published. One day, Alfie and Mum and Annie Rose were coming home from the shops. Alfie ran on ahead because he wanted to get home first. He ran all the way from the corner to the front gate, up the steps to the front door. Then he sat down on the top step and waited for the others. Along came Mum, pushing Annie Rose and the shopping. "I raced you," called Alfie. "I'm back first, so there." Annie Rose didn't care. She was tired. She sat back in her pushchair and sucked her thumb. Mum put the brake on the pushchair and left Annie Rose at the bottom of the steps, while she lifted the basket of shopping up to the top. Then she found the key and opened the front door. Alfie dashed in ahead of her. "I've won! I've won!" he shouted. Mum put the shopping down in the hall and went back down the steps to Annie Rose out of her pushchair. But what do you think Alfie did then? He gave the door a great big slam. Bang! Just like that. Then Mum was outside the door holding Annie Rose, and Alfie was inside with the shopping. Mum's key was inside too. Uh-oh, Alfie's in trouble. "Open the door, Alfie," said Mum. But Alfie didn't know how to open the door from the inside. The catch was too high up. Mum looked into the letterbox. "Try to reach the catch and turn it," she said. Alfie tried, but he couldn't quite reach it. "Can you put the key through the letterbox?" said Mum. But Alfie couldn't reach the letterbox either. Annie Rose was hungry as well as tired. She began to cry. Then Alfie began to cry too. He didn't like being all by himself on the wrong side of the door. Just then, Mrs. McNally came hurrying across the street to see what all the noise was about. She and Mum took it in turns to say encouraging things into the letterbox. But Alfie still couldn't open the door. I really like the illustrations here because this is sort of outside the door, isn't it? You see the street and there's Mum and Annie Rose. And then this is inside the house with Alfie gradually getting more and more upset. Look. "Go and fetch your little chair from the sitting room and then you'll be able to reach the catch," said Mum. But Alfie didn't try to fetch his little chair. He just went on crying louder and louder. And Annie Rose cried louder and louder too. "There's my Maureen," said Mrs. McNally. "I'm sure she'll be able to help." Mrs. McNally's Maureen was a big girl. Right away she came and joined Mum and Annie Rose and Mrs. McNally on the top step. "Might have to break a window," she said. "But I tried to climb up the drain pipe first, if you like." But Mrs. McNally didn't like that idea at all. "Oh no, Maureen, you might hurt yourself," she said. Just then, Alfie's very good friend the milkman came up the street in his milk float. When he saw Mum and Annie Rose and Mrs. McNally and Mrs. McNally's Maureen all standing on the top step, he stopped his float and said, "What's the trouble?" So they told him. "Don't worry, mate," the milkman shouted. "We'll soon have you out of there." Looks as though this lock's going to be difficult to break," said the milkman. But then Mrs. McNally's Maureen had a very good idea. She ran to ask the window cleaner, who was working up the street, if he would bring his ladder and climb up to the bathroom window. And of course, when the window cleaner heard about Alfie, he came hurrying along with his ladder as quickly as he could. And all this time, look, can you see back here? You can see that actually Alfie stopped crying. He's off. He's getting his little chair, which is what his mum initially asked him to do. He's gradually getting it by the door, look. Then Mum and Annie Rose and Mrs. McNally's Maureen and the milkman all stood up the top step while the window cleaner put his ladder up against the house. He started to climb up to the bathroom window. But when he was halfway up the ladder, What do you think happened? And actually, this is a little bit, I know we talk about inference for vipers, this is a little bit of inference. It's a picture inference, there's not necessarily in the text, but looking at the picture, what can you infer is going to happen next, looking at what we've talked about here? Have a think. Maybe tell your mum or your dad or your sister or your brother. The front door suddenly opened, and there was Alfie. He had managed to reach the catch and turn it, like that, after all. He was very pleased with himself. He opened the front door as wide as it would go and stood back grandly to let everybody in. Then the window cleaner came down from his ladder, and he and the milkman and Mrs. McNally's Maureen and Mrs. McNally and Annie Rose and Mum and Alfie all went into the kitchen and had tea together. And then look, there they are, waving goodbye. Poor Alfie, stuck in the house by himself. So, that Shirley Hughes at some point will read Dogger, one of my all-time favourites. Take care, everyone. Bye.